Welcome to ALAQA, a podcast about the relationships shaping systems, capital, and the climate transition. Today, I'm joined by James Burrows and Philipp Essl, managing directors at Better Society Capital. At BSC, James currently looks after the social lending team, which includes work on blended finance, ethical banks, and social outcomes partnerships. He explores how capital can better connect with communities. He's also building out the practice, looking at investing for more transformative systems change. Philipp focuses on social impact measurement and management across Better Society Capital's investment process and portfolio. He's passionate about using impact strategy and evidence to drive social investment decisions and tackle pressing social challenges. Together, their work reflects a broader effort to rethink how finance can support resilient communities and more equitable economic systems. Two topics that particularly caught my eye when reviewing this episode. One is around places where systems come alive. This was a very compelling argument that James and Philipp made throughout the episode. It's where complex systems become tangible by connecting issues like housing, health, energy, and economic opportunity. And the second topic is one that I struggle personally a lot with, which is the balance between urgency and reflection. How one sometimes wants to address immediate needs, but at the same time allows for space and grace and understanding and empathy to understand the complexity, to understand people's feelings, people's agencies and structures, limitations sometimes, and design interventions at last. Okay, well, hello everybody. How
Hi.
are you today?
Hi, man. Nice to see you again.
Nice to
Hi,
see you
man.
too. Welcome, Philipp.
Thank you. Feeling good, yeah.
Philipp, it's very funny because I feel I know you when in fact I don't. And I have heard so much about you through James. I heard and saw your name mentioned in so many instances, publications around systems investing, about the work you do at Better Society Capital. So I'm very happy to have you today and to have again our dearest James, who's been so generous with his time and wisdom. And I thank you because there's a certain quality of a conversation with three people which takes, let's say, even better listening skills. So for allowing the others to have the space to express themselves. So thank you for taking that little ride with me today.
Great to be here. And thanks for
Okay,
inviting us.
thank you. Thank you. First off, Philipp, a few words about you and your journey. Would you like to tell us perhaps in a few words what brought you to, I don't even know how to describe how you spend your days, what is the exact title in your job description, but what brought you to taking so much time and attention for systems investing?
Maybe a few words just in terms of my role within BSC, just to give context. So I'm head of impact. I joined 7 years ago. And so I spent my time really thinking, designing how we approach impact in the context of our investment making. But a big part then is also about thinking not just about the investment making as a tool, but our broader toolkit, the engagement work, the broader market building we do. And think about that in the context of, okay, how do we actually build this market? And what does this mean if you want to call it systems change? So similar to the approach that you're well aware of in terms of impact investing and how we manage now impact, I'm thinking about the equivalent, what that looks like at the organization level when we think about systems change. And again, there's an idea part of it. I connect with the outside world and try to bring in new ideas and share our experience with the outside world. But then there's also something around building, structure systems to embody or help us really do and then put these ideas into practice. And then I think that the third part, which is really close to my heart and really important that some people don't know, is the work actually with people. So I also coach people inside the organization, outside, because I see that sort of personal element in the personal development journey to be a really important part of the outer change journey we're on. And maybe a few words in terms of what brought me here, because there's sort of the system side to it and there's the investment side to it. And the investment side is really new. So I only tapped into the investment world when I joined BSC, but the kind of systems lens has been part of my journey pretty much from the beginning. And I think initially the impetus, what really shifted the way I look at the world was through experience with therapy, actually. So end of the 90s, there was a sort of a German school around Bert Hellinger, and then people who took that approach of visualizing and working with systems, family systems, into an organizational context. And they applied it to organizational development. And with them, sort of studied business, and it really caught my attention. And this shift from just focusing on people to actually focusing on the relationship between people and looking at organizations as systems. And that was my way of introducing systems thinking, systems practice to my own world. And that then continued. I went into international development, spent a couple of years in the world of economic development, enterprise development, market development, again with a systems lens. So rather than working directly with the people you're trying to benefit, and in my case, it was often low-income farmers, you start to intervene and think about the system that creates certain outcomes, and you intervene in the system. And again, that was taking that system lens more widely and think about sort of markets, economies as complex systems. And I think what sort of stayed with me throughout this time again was this sort of idea that we also look at ourselves as a system, and we are connected with the systems we're trying to intervene, whether it's an organization or even a broader system. When this sort of opportunity with BSc came up, it was in a way the perfect opportunity to bring all these different strands together and apply it again in a system that was very new to me, the investment ecosystem. And so it's been, really steep learning curve, right? And a bit applying what I'm trying to also teach or help other people do to my own life, because essentially I knew, to be honest, very little about investment, and I had to learn a lot and have to learn a lot from people like James and others.
Well, that's fascinating. There's so many ways and so many avenues to get into that topic. So thank you for sharing that, Philip. So back to what you're doing today. Perhaps, so first question to both of you. You used many times just in this introduction, Philip, the word think. I think about this, I was thinking about that. And this field of systems change using investment and in finance in general, or systems investing, this whole field gathers a number of people who enjoy thinking a lot. And I'm one of these people who enjoy questioning concepts, who thrive in designing new concepts and thinking and imagining new concepts, etc. How do you take this part of your work, which is interesting because you're at the forefront, you're pioneering new possibilities. How do you take that knowledge, this wealth of concepts, and help people in your team, like James and others, to deliver these conceptual and sometimes difficult new ideas into reality with all its obstacles and imperfections? How do you do that?
What really landed with me was you reflecting back the word think. Because I think there's a risk in all of that to get stuck in the thinking. And the immediate sort of response that comes up is that the why I think this is important is in real lived experience. I shared a little bit my path here, but if we were diving into the different sort of milestones along these journeys of turning points, there were moments where I realized what we were doing was not working. I realized that in relation with real people and in the context of a real place I was working in, we were trying to increase incomes, but we failed to do it. And I was sort of left with this question, why does this not work? I was trying to build an organization with a few other people, and we had all the support and resources, yet we failed, in my view, because we didn't understand ourselves as complex systems and the baggage we brought to these endeavors. So there's real experience. As an investment industry, we tap ourselves on the shoulder every year when I go to these conferences, yet the big issues don't really change. Why? And I think that really leaves me with a sense of urgency of we have to do something differently. So that's the starting point. Now, to do that, I think also, and that's where maybe bringing the coaching in, it's not enough to understand that in our heads. because we also need to feel that. You got to feel the pain that we are not making progress. This is not just an intellectual exercise of, okay, what would be an alternative concept that might be a better fit? No, that really pains me to see that it's something is not working. Real people are in pain. They're suffering, right? So I think that's the important starting point. Therefore, I think when I look at our organization, when I look at the people that I work with, I think you also then need different intervention points to try to shift the way we work. And in a way, the most powerful things that I've encountered is when I'm in direct relationship with people. That's also a bit like my sweet spot. But when I really understand and feel how somebody thinks and operates and shows up, and I can find, or at least I sense these opportunities for introducing new ideas without maybe even using the language. But if we break it down, what we mean, often we start with better listening. I was briefly looking at James' previous sort of conversation he had, and this point of being humble came up. That's so important, to pause for a moment and say, maybe I don't have the right solution, or maybe I should sit with this problem for a little bit longer, and maybe I should listen to people in a different way, in a deeper way. So there's something around really personal behavioral mindset, sort of belief systems that I think are really powerful, where you want to connect. And then, of course, you bring that to the next level and you say, okay, maybe what are some of the structures we put in place to allow for that? What questions can we ask in the way we operate that open spaces for reflections, that open spaces for conversations we would otherwise not have? And we are far from perfect, right? But I think that's then where you think about, okay, what does the organization actually need to look like from a design perspective, from a culture perspective? What behaviors, what values do we need to instill to allow for that?
I was going to start there at where you talked about in terms of the structures, the frameworks, the putting those things on top. So when Philipp joined, we'd been going for a number of years already. We'd been doing a lot of stuff along the lines of financial returns, impact on people, and then also around market development. The most recent strategy, just before Philipp had joined, we'd started doing a little bit more things with intentional operating in systems thinking a little bit, without an overarching framework for how we affect systems in that way. Some of the first sets of conversations that Philipp and I started having was, okay, which of these are investing in those deeper transformations, those systems? What does that look like? How might we, through the things that we can do, that we are doing on the ground, codify them a little bit so that we can bring them to a level where you can then start having those conversations with the wider group, with the wider teams. Back to your question of how do you bring other people along? There's got to be a common understanding and an alignment of what you're trying to do and a way of translating that for people so they go, oh, we are doing this here, we can improve how we're doing those things there. The bits of work that we were doing in places, that we were doing with particular products, and how we thought about that. And then through that then informed our entire next strategy and a lot of the stuff that came out in our 10 lessons for the type of investor that we are today as an investor in systems change. So that was one part of it. So really looking at what we were doing, bringing Philipp's background in, documenting and framing that, and then helping to share, teach, upskill, and then embedding it forward into everything that we do. I think the other point that Philipp touched on, and I think he underplays it a little bit, is the transformational people work that is at the heart of some of that stuff. He said enough, but that was the second sort of bit, particularly internally, that he and other colleagues who are trained coaches, where people who we operate in an environment, as all people who work with systems, where the outcomes aren't certain and there's many bumps along the road. And so you need to be really comfortable with uncertainty. You just need to be able to keep going, to be able to reflect, to be able to then still do. So it's this push and pull between the reflection, the what might be working, what's not, the sense making, but then also the stepping out and having the confidence to go and do. We often have a lot of people who can either do some of that, but not all of it. And so how do we take people who are incredible doers and help them be more reflective? And how do we take people who are incredibly good thinkers and help them be better doers and combine some of those different things and then a whole bunch of other stuff? And that coaching practice that Philipp described with other colleagues here really helps take those individuals and helps mold them into the systems agents effectively within our organization and then out with our wider colleagues and partners. And then the third bit of work that Philipp's really helped us do is connect and share some of those things that we're doing internally out into various forums, gatherings, convenings, communities of practice effectively, so that we are not just doing things internally in our own bubble, but playing a role to help shape those movements and get access to the learning so we can improve how we're going and then share that back out as well. So he's played that transformational role there as well through things like Twist, through things like the Transcap initiative, Deep Transitions Lab latterly, other parts of the ecosystem that people will be aware of.
Thank you for that. To be honest, I have probably 5 questions which popped up in my mind, but we don't have time for that. So I would just mention the fact that you said, James, we need people to become more comfortable with uncertainty. We could have a whole episode just on that. The notion of power, of relationship to risk, relationship to control, the relationship to who do you accept to take with you to navigate this uncertainty. So many questions, but I will leave it there for our listeners to think for themselves on this topic. So back to my second question. Last time we spoke, James, you spoke a lot about your work in what you call place-based investing or place-based interventions. So is it another word for systems change or systems investing? Is it a subcategory? Is it a thematic expression of this approach? Just one of our other guests works on food systems in South Africa, or another one works on energy systems, supporting the transition of energy systems in Europe. Is it just another thematic, another variety of this systems lens? Or no, it's a way to start developing a practice then can be expanded into many other thematic things. What can you tell us on this?
My view on this, and I think in your question there is seeds of all of the answers. If I was going to boil it down to one thing, I think it is as close to a perfect physical model representation of how would we bring this conceptual systems investing to life in as concrete, often in concrete, as way as possible. That's how I view a place-based approach and how it connects to a systems lens. Now, that doesn't mean it's easier. And often it can mean it's trickier because it has interlocking other systems, economic systems, social issue systems, all of those other things within the context of that concrete bounded area and place that you've got. What a system needs in order for it to be systems investing, it needs to be bounded. And in a place you have those physical bounds and structures of where you're engaging and how you're doing. But then over the top of that start to go, okay, what are the dynamics that are at play that exist within that area? However bounded, however large, however small. Who are the actors who exist, who show up, who intervene in, who play a role in shaping, who influence that area? And what are the tools in the toolkit that are needed? What are the projects in that portfolio that might need to be both from within or without, if it's nested within a wider geography? How do those things start to interact? So that's how I would categorize it. It's almost the perfect physical, as close to perfect physical representation or manifestation of a system or a systems investing. It's why I think people often start there. And you often see people who are doing some of this stuff where we want to bring it to life on the ground. They're trying to move from conceptual thinking and they
abstract.
go, exactly. How do you land it in a place where there are individuals who care about some of that stuff and you see some of these dynamics and how they might play out? It's not that it's easier, but it's often easier to see and feel in that kind of a concept and see how that plays out. So I think that's how I'd start.
Yeah, really well put. I think for me, the importance of place in this conversation is because it also speaks to the so what. Sometimes we get a bit lost in system for system's sake. And I think what place introduces
We're
is,
already in the controversial take.
well, we can get a lot more controversial. Ultimately, it comes back to systems that impact people or planet, right? And so by place, you close that feedback loop. I would go further than say to illustrate, but it's an important part of the ultimate feedback loop, right? We shouldn't forget that the whole reason why we think that systems change investing, whatever word you want to use, systemic investing, can ultimately lead to better outcomes for people and planet. And looking at place where those outcomes manifest is a very useful and powerful way to organize yourself, but also to hold yourself accountable and say, does it really make a difference?
And we've shifted our approach and our strategy to how we view or show up in place in various ways. We had an explicit strategy for a number of years that was called place, and we focused on either places as systems themselves, or what are the models that might exist or benefit multiple places and exist in every place, whether that's community finance, whether that's community energy, community-owned energy, community-led housing, those kind of projects. In this current strategy, we've got grand challenges, and how we view places is those real areas where these things show up, how they intersect, how they interlock. So we've got one that's around climate and energy. We've got one that's around tackling health inequality. We've got one that's about economic opportunity, and one that's around housing and housing affordability and appropriate. All of those intersect in the context of the place, as how Philip described it, people's lives, how they show up, what their communities look, feel like, what their resources are, how much agency or ownership they have over how they do things, the actors who are there based in the long run, who've all got similar but probably different goals along the lines of different ones of those. How do you bring those together so you have a stock of housing that is also benefiting people and planet, that is energy efficient, but also contributing to people's ability to then go and get good, sustainable jobs? And those things show up in place in a way that brings our challenges to life, is how we're starting to orient our work, even though it's not a focus on place, but it's the context within which some of these things show up.
You know, ALAQA means a relationship. It's one of the meanings of the word in Arabic. And in both your discussions until now, you seem to really care about this notion of relationship. They matter a lot, as much as capital, or perhaps even more. So what kinds of relationships, in your opinion, need to exist for an investment to not be a mere positive investment or impact investment, and become something which looks like your definition of a systems change, the systems change category? What does it take in terms of relationships? What kinds of relationships need to exist? And you can see it, just to build on the question and leave you some time to reflect, through the process of investment, through the sourcing, through the interaction when you start putting together perhaps the opportunity, or when you start designing for the orchestration phase as well. Because a feedback I've been receiving quite a lot recently is, oh, but we already do a lot of impact investing. Isn't it good enough? Should we really get into the weeds of these very difficult concepts of systems change? So how could you encourage them to build extra additional relationships, and of what nature, to truly become as transformational and have the nature of interventions that, Philip, you described, to go from the failure that you saw to the actual positive outcome that you were looking for?
I'll put a few ideas out there. I think to be truly intentional about doing systems investing in this way, I think you've got to, the word that comes to mind, multiple. When you talk about relationships, it's about multiple. So it's one part, multiple relationships. You can't move systems on your own. So actually, how are you thinking about your, and we used this phrase, I think, last time we spoke, and often around your role amongst others. So where are you showing up? What role are you playing with the capital and the investments that you're making? How does that sit within a wider whole? That's the first sort of set of multiple. Your role, your partners, who are they? What's missing? How do you bring those things through? I think the second way relationships relate to multiple is to be intentional. It's about multiple interventions and investments layering into a portfolio. using different tools around some of that stuff. One investment can play a role in systems investing, but if you want to have a systems lens on all that you do, how those things play together, let's bring that to life with an example. When we think about our work with community finance, for example, unlocking an investment into a community lender, a community development finance institution, needs a relationship with policymakers who can provide a guarantee often, needs a relationship with the understanding the enterprises and what their ecosystem looks like and what support they might need over and above some of that stuff. It needs a relationship with the additional finance providers who could come in alongside you, whether they're senior lenders or otherwise, to understand their structures. So you're already deploying these interventions of, yes, I'm putting capital to work, but I'm also then engaging with policymakers to say, okay, do we need to change or think about how that program comes together? And we did that with the British Business Bank a couple of different times alongside our work at Better Society Capital, where we now have something called the Community Enable Fund that they've put in place that is really trying to expand and scale the availability of finance into these institutions, that's brought together those different roles and different interventions over time. A multiple year journey. So that's the other way multiple comes in. It's not a one and done thing. It's those regular feedback loops that add up over time, and listening and sense making around that. So that's the kind of the first sets of relationships all around how things relate to multiple relationships, multiple roles, multiple tools, and multiple projects and investments in practice, multiple years. Now, that's not to say that people can't contribute to those things. And there's a question around whether they're intentional or not and whether that matters. But if you're describing yourself as being intentional about affecting those systems, I think that's the level at which you need to be knowing where you're operating within that system.
I really love that. Just maybe to sort of play that back as well in my words. But the premise is that real outcomes for people are created by systems, not by single entities. And therefore, if we want to change outcomes, whether that's provide people with better housing or enable better health, then we need to intervene across the system and not just in a single unit. And I think that's James' point there in terms of, if that's true, if you buy into that idea, then by definition, you will have to start to hold multiple relationships across the system. Because one-on-one is three, right? I mean, that's the sort of idea. It's these combinatorial effects that exist when we intervene at different leverage points, which is one of the sort of the idea that look in the system and be precise where you intervene to get outsized impact based on the feedback you. So I think totally. And the other point that resonates as well is the time element, right? Over time. I was recently in a conversation with someone who really challenged a little bit the current approach the systemic investing community takes. And what he was sort of saying was, we approach this in a very linear way. So when we program, when we do what James explains, it's just, we sort of think that, that it's a sort of a linear way into the future. Right? The multiple years, and we'll do this, and then this hopefully unfolds. So there's still a sort of a linearity in some of the assumptions we're making. And the reality is that most likely systems change will happen in the context of really significant shocks over the next couple of years. I mean, just take the sort of 3-degree scenario, if that becomes true. Major disruptions within a very short period of time. And so the question is, what do you do then? What does it look like, what you're trying to achieve here? And when you follow that logic, I think where you end up is with this idea of resilience. What matters in these moments where these shocks occur is whether a system is able to respond. Place, we talked about place. Can a place respond? So then the question is, what does it take to do that? And I think relationships between the different actors across the system are major, right? I think the strength of your relationship is probably the most important determinant in terms of the resilience of your system, the ability to respond.
We said that you would not say anything that would make me cry. We made this implicit pact at the beginning, so stop.
You've got the wrong guest in, man, if that's the goal.
I'm too much stressed. I'm too emotional today to take it anymore. So stop.
Can I build on that? And I'm going to loop us back round because I think the other thing, back to your original question of what's the relationship part
Yes.
that's needed there, I think it comes back to that work that Philip talked about that he's doing with our individuals and our people.
Yeah.
That I think that systems change actually starts with yourself around some of that stuff. And you can't change a system if you're not also changing yourself, actually. And so there's an element of that internal practice, that how are you viewing the dealing with uncertainty, the
Hmm.
ability to show up and be in listening mode in a way that previously maybe you were in telling mode or directing
Mm.
mode. What are those other ways of viewing those relationships differently that starts with that internal change? And those things will happen at different paces. And
Mm.
again, will totally not be linear in
Uh,
various ways. And we'll have days where we cry and we'll have days where we laugh and we'll have days where we don't do anything
uh,
in between. And so there's some of that stuff that say that if you're wanting to go on this journey, that changing yourself that then changes your concentric circles around you starts to then have that impact on your team, your organization, your partners, the things that you're trying to do. I think that there's an element of bringing that back to the individual center as well.
And the relational bit. In a way, you invite these topics through your question, right? Based on everything we said, I think totally there's something in terms of how do I show up? What is the work I'm doing to be able to respond rather than react? Is to be open rather than close, to hold complexity rather than wanting to control, right? There's stuff that I can do, but there's also a quality dimension that sits in the relationship between us. And trust is really important. But yet, this really interesting concept, what is it? Can you create it? I learned that the hard way, but this idea that, oh, trust me, is total nonsense. It doesn't work, right?
for sure. For sure.
So how do you then create trust based on the assumption that relationships, where we talk about it, rely on trust?
You know what is difficult for me at this point, and it raises a nearly existential question, to be honest, is this notion of urgency, of not awareness, but knowledge of the hardships and the tragedies and the trauma and the pain and the injustices and the suffering that is already happening. It's not a will, it is already happening. Okay. And thinking about the enormity of the challenges that you are describing very nicely. How do we build trust? How do we reform ourselves? How do we challenge the current structures? It will take, I don't know, an eternity. So, in a way, I feel very drawn towards this notion of urgency. We have to make things very quickly, and we nearly in a reactive mode precisely because we want to. And I am, of all people, aware that reactive solutions are not the best, but you want to try and do something. And a lot of impact investors around me are in that mindset. We cannot wait to have the perfectly designed systems and orchestration and alliances. And okay, we have to make it happen. But at the same time, it's not maladaptation, but it's malinvesting or something like that. Are we supporting and channeling the means and the resources and the time and the human ingenuity to the things that will actually help people down the line and not precipitate and accelerate even more suffering? So this tension here, and I don't have the answer, but I'm just sharing with you this tension that is very difficult for me. And when I hear some of my very dear colleagues, they say, oh, your thing, it's great. And oh, you talk about relationships, but we work here. We have a real job here. Building relationships is not a job. Or we're in finance. It's not our job to build orchestration capabilities. We have to deploy money. So this notion of being supposedly non-realists or not pragmatic enough or not quick enough versus we want to make it right. How do you feel about this tension and this duality?
It totally resonates, Iman. And I've been struggling with that myself. A few thoughts came up in terms of, I think, how I'm dealing with it or what has helped me. When you listen into what you share, and when I hear myself, I think there's often the yearning for the right answer. I want to see it and I want to control it. So give me the right answer that tells me what's right, what's the right thing to do here. Where I'm landing is that maybe trying to embrace a little bit of really this idea of complex system and not being able ever to really understand it, is that you need both. You know, you need the doctor in the emergency room to fix somebody who has a problem now. Scientists who think about more effective efficiency for the future that will take years to put into practice. The doctor might see them at a conference and walk away and like, oh my God, these guys, in what world are they living? Like thinking about something like I just spent 3 hours here and probably could have saved 3 people's lives. I'm going to do back and do the right thing. And the doctors feel like, yes, it's great that you save people's lives, but what I'm working on will save 1 million. I think we need both. And so can I let go of having what the right mix is, what it exactly looks like at this moment, and just sit with and say both? And what then in terms of for us, we choose, and every organization and individual choose what part and where they will contribute. And that will depend on their mission, what their capabilities are. But it's a choice. And I think what's important there is to look at the problem that you're solving. And I'm really oversimplifying it. But if it is a problem that is fairly well understood with an existing solution, then we can act today. And maybe we can try to scale or whatever you want to add to that. A doctor, like somebody comes in with a broken leg, we know how to fix this. We don't need to reflect and build relationship. And no, we can do it. We follow a procedure and know exactly what to do. But when it comes to homelessness in a place, we need to sit with that a bit longer to understand the local context. And so what problem are you solving and what does that mean in terms of you then how you show up? The danger with the sense of urgency is that we are faced with a problem and we need to react now. And we treat something that is adaptive, that is not well understood as if it was, and just apply a solution to fix it, because that doesn't work. And so the last point I will make is that despite all the sense of urgency and need for speed, I have come to realize for me that the moment of pause, where you just sit with yourself, the experience of being triggered and wanting to jump into a solution for a few seconds, maybe an hour as a collective, and acknowledge it. And you really want to act now, but let's just pause. And what are we dealing with here? What's asked from us? How do we respond rather than act? Can go miles down the line. When we jump, we put something in, we shuffle it down, and then later we realize it's not the right thing. People didn't want to really have it. We haven't aligned it. And then we need to backtrack and spend way more time and energy to do that.
My reaction tells me you're onto something, Philip, because I think I had a tension of reactions. I really want to challenge parts of what you're saying, but also I really deeply agree and resonate with so many of us. And I'm like, the wrestle and tension as you were speaking, I was like, yeah, both things. Okay, yeah, that is the both things. The one bit I would push on a little bit here is I think there is what of those behaviors or ways that we're showing up do we value more in terms of those emphases at various points in time? And I think we are a little bit too much in our current Western context that we exist and operate in, of the conversations you were describing, Imen, of show up, do, here's our goal. It's very linear. It's very well defined. This is what we're going to go and do. And we're much less valuing the long-term relationship to people and planet, the small f feminine versus the small m masculine sort of concepts.
Ooh, let me challenge that.
I'm in inverted commas around some of that. I'm in inverted commas around some of those. The mother nature angle, the language that we've always used around some of that stuff is what I'm really getting at.
Yeah.
And I think we don't value that enough in our current society, which I think has implications to the kind of conversations that we end up having as we show up and that sort of thing. Now, back to your questions around language and it's important and those kind of things. But
yeah,
that was the way it showed up. The second point, Philip, I think was that you were talking about there was around how people show up and the relationships and how that stuff plays out. I think it's just about the balance. I think it's just the balance of those and the urgency. There is that concept of you're too, particularly in religious traditions or around some of those ones where sometimes people go, I don't have time to meditate. I don't have time to pray. And people go, you're actually too busy not to meditate. You're too busy not to pray, because it's in those moments that things start to come together, that things start to integrate a little bit. So I completely agree. I completely agree with that concept.
Okay, that was a rich last question. Time for a flash round, which I will slightly tweak because I would like James to chime in as well. So it's big questions and short answers. Are you ready? Yes? So the first one is one action you wish more investors would take in their journey towards systems change.
For me, it's acknowledge you don't know and take the first step.
For me, it's introducing the question, what's the system I'm intervening in and what impact do I have on it?
So one book, a music or a practice that helps you to hold complexity and the tensions that we were discussing earlier.
For me, it is basic mindfulness practice. So observing my thoughts, my emotions, and my physical sensations that strengthen that muscle of just pausing between trigger and response.
For me, it's what I learned from observing my 2 young children and how they just show up so differently than us as partially more fully developed humans. They just never cease to amaze me, the amount of attention and detail they can focus on in moments without knowing what else is going on around them, but then find those bits of deep joy. And there's so much to learn. That's another podcast, but yeah.
Okay. My third question would be one recommendation for the investors out there or the asset owners, by the way, who would like to be more involved into systems change, but don't really know where to start. So one recommendation.
Go and check out the existing resources that are there. The websites like Twist and some of their case studies are there. Their Deep Transitions Lab and some of their frameworks and their case studies that are there. See whether that actually resonates with how you are currently thinking. I think there's more commonality or more along the way that you're trying to make some of that stuff happen than you realize.
Send me an email to get in touch with me. But I would particularly highlight, I guess, Twist, because Twist is a community of practitioners at different levels in their journey, and it's a beautiful way to just connect with somebody and have a conversation.
Okay, and last question, what gives you hope in the space you operate in right now? What gives you hope?
So for me, it's conversations with the people I work with and just experiencing the level of care. That's the biggest hope. It's in the immediate relationships and the people that are closest to me.
I think it's letting go of the control that you think you might have, but the knowing that actually some of what we're doing here is preparing ourselves for that next bit. So you can't see how that's going to turn out, but actually intentional preparedness for those moments, for those shocks, for how we're going to respond, the strengthening of the fabric of those relationships that comes through these kind of conversations with others, so that when those things happen, you've got the tools and the toolkits that may play a role. You've got those relationships and networks you can call on to go, who's coming with us, who's going to take the lead, how are we going to do some of this stuff, and then being on that journey together. I think that's the bit.
Thank you both. Thank you so much for the discussion. Philip, thank you for sharing a little bit of your internal thoughts, and James, thank you again for being you.
I show up for the challenges, because it actually, without that, it's looking in the mirror, isn't it? You go, this isn't quite right, this is really good, this is less good. And you don't get that if you don't have these kind of conversations. So I really appreciate making the time in all of the busyness, and for pushing us and for leading us and steering us and all the rest.
Thank you for listening to ALAQA. If this conversation sparked something for you, share it, leave a review, and subscribe for more dialogues at the intersection of capital, systems, and transformation.